Welcome to a new episode of the Tolkien Experience podcast. I'm Luke Shelton.
I'm Sarah Westvick.
And I'm Sarah Brown.
Each episode, we share with you an interview of a Tolkien scholar or fan.
That's right. In these interviews, one of us asks our guests to respond to 6 questions that help us learn about their personal Tolkien experience.
All of this is made possible by our supporters on Patreon. So we want to thank them and encourage you to check out the community at patreon.com/Tolkien Experience.
We are so excited to share this podcast with you. So without any more delay, let me introduce our guest. I am so glad to share with you that our first guest of Season 3 is none other than Ted Nasmith. Ted is very well known in Tolkien art circles as being a well-established artist whose work is quite remarkable. Ted has had the opportunity to illustrate Tolkien's own work, most recently the illustrated Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales in 2022. Both are available now. Ted's also won the Tolkien Society Awards in 2019 and 2021 for Best Artwork. Finally, I did want to mention that he has a written piece in the 2023 Tolkien calendar that's just been published. And so please support Ted in these different ventures. And without any further ado, I'd like to get straight into his history with Tolkien. So typically our first question is just kind of getting to know how you first came to be in how you first interacted with Tolkien. So our first question is, how were you introduced to Tolkien's work?
Right. Well, that's easy. I guess I would have been 14 back around 1968. Anyway, there in that neighborhood, I was just getting into high school, and my sister, who was older and had some friends who were Tolkien fans in her high school, had recommended The Lord of the Rings. There's a bit of a fan group there, and she said, I think you'll like this, and handed me the Fellowship of the Ring in paperback, so that was it. That was how I was introduced.
So you started with The Lord of the Rings. Did you kind of go straight from Fellowship to the others, or was there kind of a lag between reading each book?
No, I think I pretty much continued to read Two Towers and Return of the King in quick succession, although I did savor them. I remember savoring the book. I wasn't going to rush through it or anything. I just was absolutely loving it, of course, and just taking it in completely. So, I would have read all 3 of them. And I remember it being around the Christmas holidays, maybe 68, something like that.
Nice. So after you finished The Lord of the Rings, what was your next text? What did you move on to?
Right, and then I would have read The Hobbit quickly from there. I believe my mom had been reading it already, and she was a school teacher, so she was reading it to her kids in chapter by chapter sort of installments, and always leaving them on a cliffhanger too, so that was nice. She completely thoroughly approved of my interest in Tolkien once she realized that I was interested in it and was starting to draw pictures, get ideas from that, and so that was another thing that it just very much was a new direction artistically, whereas I was in high school in an art course and looking to be an illustrator, but was mostly interested in automotive art at the time, and still am, but it was like Tolkien was okay, that one's going to have to be a primary inspiration as well, it looks like.
So you went from Lord of the Rings to The Hobbit. How long of a gap was there between The Hobbit to something like the Silmarillion?
That was a few years. I mean, and at that time, remember, this is the late 60s into the early 70s, and Silmarillion came out in 77. So there was a big lag there, and I was, at that time, furiously drawing scenes and making little paintings and things from Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. So I was well occupied, and I was, I guess, aware that the Silmarillion was going to be published. But like a lot of people, I was just caught up with The Lord of the Rings and quite happy with that. And anything new would have been nice, but it wasn't, a super important question for me in those days. Just the fact that I was able to turn my love of the books into drawings and then acrylic paintings. The first ones were pretty much acrylics, except for maybe the very, very first one in gouache. And I was able to do the first couple of them that I did, inspired directly by Tolkien, as a school project. So I thought that was pretty cool. I was able to kind of, integrate them into my work at the time.
Nice.
Mm-hmm.
So since you were exposed to this kind of as a high schooler, I imagine you could get credit in school, but you probably couldn't get paid for it at that point.
Nope.
How long were you kind of doing the Tolkien art on your own, and then when did it kind of start becoming more of something you could do professionally?
Right. And it was a question for me fairly quickly, like, wonder if there's a way to get these illustrations and drawings and ideas picked up by a publisher or some other, way of promoting them. This is when, let's see, 1973, the year Tolkien died, and the first calendars came out from Ballantine in New York. I guess they were accompanied, because the Ballantine paperback edition of The Lord of the Rings was the first one that I read. And I picked up the calendars as soon as I saw them in the stores. I got the one from 73, 74. They were both featuring Tolkien's art. And then in 75, Tim Kirk was the illustrator. And that was the first time I was introduced to this idea that they might be publishing showcases of illustrators, because the next year, 76, was the Hildebrandt brothers. And then, as we know, there were two more that would come out in 77 and 78. So they had a kind of a trilogy of calendars. And we were introduced to the 36 artworks in there. And that fired me up, as did Tim Kirk's illustrations published. And that's pretty much the time when I realized, okay, I've got to set my sights on this idea of having my artwork in a calendar at least. And I had one of my uncles in Scotland, a distant cousin actually, an elderly man, but he was well connected with the art community in Edinburgh, Scotland. And so he actually wrote to George Allen and Unwin, Tolkien's publishers in London, on my behalf, because he was very impressed with my early work as well and wanted to see if he could give me a little bit of an introduction. I did get a letter back from them, and they more or less said, The Lord of the Rings, we're not planning any illustrated editions at this time. I guess they thought that that's what I was interested in, because I don't think George Allen and Unwin were publishing anything but, I think there was a Silmarillion calendar and a Hobbit calendar, and I believe I have those, and they came from the English publishers, but the main illustrator calendars were from Ballantine ongoing, and eventually they were integrated together from HarperCollins, I guess, at the point when HarperCollins and Tolkien's publishers merged. It would have been Unwin Hyman at that time, yeah, so it gets complicated, but there it was, seeing these artists being published, and that I felt like, that's where I'm definitely headed for that. And I kept on plugging away for about 15 years until the mid-'80s, and then I finally I joined the Tolkien Society. That led to introductions to people at George Allen and Unwin, and then interest in my art for a possible calendar, and that turned out to be the 1987.
Wow, fantastic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's quite a story, in fact. But gradually I got there, and I had a lot of artwork by the time I was in a position to be published. And so 4 of them were included in the 87 calendar, along with a couple of gentlemen that I would end up seeing a lot of, Alan Lee and John Howe, as well as Roger Garland. Yeah.
Nice.
Mm-hmm.
So when you think about Tolkien's work and the different times that you visited it, is there one time that really stands out to you as like this time reading the book or watching a film or hearing an audiobook really stands out to me as like one of my favorite experiences with the work? I guess it's all sort of spread out over periods of years, that it's, I don't know if I have a one moment or any particular experience where it was, it stood out. I mean, the reading of Lord of the Rings itself for the first time has to be the most important and most emotional part of the situation. I don't think, because we only had, I forget what year it came out,
maybe it was in the early 80s, but the BBC radio edition of Lord of the Rings. That definitely captivated me, and anything where I saw artwork that I thought was interesting and captured Tolkien reasonably well would also galvanize me to see what I could do. And I guess I can name one thing, and that would be when Joan Wyatt, her Middle-earth portfolio, I believe it's called, or album, Middle-earth album, now it is. So this series of artworks by her of The Lord of the Rings, this English amateur illustrator, not particularly well known, but had somehow gotten in touch with the right people and had her artwork published in an edition. And seeing that stuff, which was maybe 40 or 50 illustrations and paintings, just fairly loose, but very expressive and very much in the spirit of Tolkien. And that got me interested in the possibility of doing some of the same scenes, but doing them in a much more sort of professional, sophisticated way. It definitely led to the scene of the Barrow Wights. Three hobbits lying in the Barrow, and captive of the Barrow Wights. And she had done a scene of that, which was kind of cartoony, a little kind of funny looking and caricature-ish, I guess you might say. And I thought, well, that deserves to be done in a way that's a little more carefully planned and a little bit more sophisticated. So in that way, I guess it stood out definitely. But things of that kind, when it came along, would just give me a bit of a boost.
So I'm going to ask you the question that I know is difficult for any artist. Can you pick one piece or one scene or one chapter that is your favorite that you've illustrated or painted?
I guess, Rivendell certainly would be at the top of that list. I would imagine there's about 10 contenders for favorites and that stand out in one way or another. But the Rivendell series of paintings, because I did one back in 1980, I guess it is, the big one that's most familiar to most people, and it's available as a print. And it was just an homage to Tolkien's own drawings. I mean, his own artwork has always been a bit of a consistent inspiration for me. So then Rivendell's continued in different versions from then on, with one for Iron Crown Enterprises and another one for some other series, I forget which. I'd done ones for games that you needed a little illustration, say. And then a few years ago, I did one called The Pear Valley of Rivendell, and it was taking a view from the valley floor near to the dwelling, Elrond's house. And that was directly inspired by my landscape artist that I liked at that, who I admire, Andreas Achenbach. And I loved his beautiful skies and the detail and subtleties and so on like that. I was seeing this German 19th century landscape artist. So I borrowed from him a bit of that one, and I always, find that these different landscape artists that I do follow supply me with ideas and style ideas and things of this kind, and that just continues on and on. But I guess Rivendell would be a favorite. Definitely, if I have favorite paintings, things like the kinslaying at Alqualondé in the Silmarillion, that was one that Christopher Tolkien particularly encouraged me to do. I thought it was a particular triumph as far as composition and content. And so that one stands out. And there are certainly others. Eowyn and the Nazgul, I believe, is one of the earlier ones that I thought really pretty good, pretty much got that drama of that scene, and I've seen certainly a number of them by other artists as well over the years. Oh, I can talk a long time about favorites. The newest ones, like he beheld Gondel amid the snow with Tour and in Unfinished Tales, that painting, I mean, that was one that was when I reread that passage out of Unfinished Tales rather than the Silmarillion, and it mentioned the snow, it was like suddenly it hit me like, oh my goodness, this entire thing is in winter, and my earlier version of that wasn't, but it was because it was describing the green valley of Tumlodden, where the city is. And I think Tolkien should have been reminded that, oh, by the way, when Tuor arrives, it's the middle of winter, actually. And so that was, of course, the more definitive version of it. And it was lovely to discover that, because then I immediately saw this beautiful sort of morning scene, and include more of the figures as described in the account, which is quite a few of them, actually, but accompanying him at that point. And then seeing this vision of the fairy city.
Yeah, it's great to hear you talk about your own art, because it's such an insight into your own kind of preferences in the different things that you've attempted, and I think that's a fascinating insight.
Thank you.
It does. I do wonder, because I think one of the things that you mentioned, and that a lot of people mention when they talk about your art, is the landscape that you deal with. You tend to do a lot. Mm-hmm. You do a lot of character work, but you also have a lot of paintings where you have the characters are kind of minute and they're in a grand scale of landscape.
Right.
How much do you think that we all know that Tolkien describes his natural settings a lot, and so I wonder, how much do you really lean into his descriptions, or how much do you just kind of use to use the Hollywood term, I guess, like, are you inspired by his description? So, like, you use that as a touchstone, but then you go on and embellish in your own ways.
Right. I guess it's somewhere kind of all of the above there. And depending on the piece of art as well, there's quite a likelihood at times that I will see something in a photo or one of my own photos or something that seems to me captures a mood or a feeling that isn't necessarily what Tolkien described, but does definitely nicely capture this place in this moment, or whatever it might be. And in other cases, yes, I definitely have, and I would always read what Tolkien describes before doing much of anything else, and then see how it agrees with what I feel it ought to be. And I have been careful about that, and quite devoted to making sure that, at the very least, it's reasonably consistent with what he describes as far as the details of the place and so on. Whether the situation itself he describes is consistent or usable for painting, those are other questions that arise. And I recently did one which was Gorfendel's Bane, with the fairly well-known scene of the Balrog as the refugees from Gondolin sacking are trying to cross the pass and are waylaid by orcs, and Balrog appears, and Gorfendel, of course, very courageously has a great moment of his battle with that, and they both fall to their deaths, etc. Well, it's described at night. And here's where, I get analytical with my friends Alex Lewis and Ruth Lake, and who I use as consultants fairly consistently. And we talked about this thing, and I said, we've been to Switzerland together, all of us. We know what the Alps are like and how long it would take most people to climb over a mountain pass. It's not going to happen in 2 or 3 hours. It's going to take most of the night. And maybe they get to the top of the pass by morning. And this is a lot of people who are injured and straggling and so on, as women and as children and all this. It's going to slow you down. So I just thought about it logically that way. And I thought, well, I need this to be a daylight scene. I need it to be just as dawn is breaking. And then we see this Balrog before, and in a situation where we can see everything fairly clearly. And I don't have to employ the kind of theater tricks that you do at night scenes to illuminate things a bit better, and that's all just part of the illustrator's job anyway. But I thought I will ignore that one detail about the night and treat it as a day scene, because I feel that it ultimately meets more of the right criteria to be accurate to Tolkien. And so these are the kinds of funny things that end up, kind of paradoxically giving you a better illustration of scene. I thought of another one too, and I forget what that was now. But where, in Durin's Crown in the Mirror, which is another recent painting. That's one of the ones that I won the award from the Tolkien Mythopoeic Society. And so in that case, what had happened in the scene where they're trying to go across the pass of Caradhras, right? And they are beaten back by a big snowstorm, and it's sort of malevolent, and there seems to be some sort of evil power in it, etc. And so they, retreat and go through the mines of Moria. And when they come out on the other side of the mountains, it's still the same time of year, which is December. We go by the calendar. Well, there's no mention of any snow at this point now. And so I thought, that's a problem, because he actually describes the turf around the mirror as green, as this green grass and sward or whatever. And I thought, we can't have that. It's just not accurate. Even if you had a slight climate change between one mountain range and one side and the other, it still would not amount to bare ground, probably. So in order, for the sake of consistency, let's have some snow here, even if it's not a complete snow blanket. And so those are the kinds of things that lead to some interesting discussions and technical problems and other things. And I didn't want to distract from the main subject, which was this mirror, and some carefully plotted reflections in order to capture that exact description that, it looked like when you looked down into the water that it was a night sky with stars, even though it was daylight. And so it was just a lot of fun to capture all those kind of elements and have something that was reasonably consistent with the storyline as well, logically. I mean, there's a bit of a description of snow a little later on in the journey toward Lothlorien, but it's clear that Tolkien is done with winter at this point.
So in thinking about, you've talked about several different scenes that you've revisited. Is there a part of Tolkien's work that's your favorite part to read, even though it may not be like your favorite one to interact with artistically?
If it's one that I like to read, it's usually something that I would also like to illustrate and have illustrated. I would say the early scenes in the Shire, across the Green Hill Country and Woody End and that sort of thing. I consistently love that part of the story, whether it's night scenes or day scenes. I think it's just very much pure Tolkien kind of magic. And then I've, for some reason, been drawn to the Mordor episodes where it's just the two hobbits, Sam and Frodo, and how they cross the plain of Gorgoroth and make their way to Mount Doom. And I think there's some interesting scenes there that I have taken on a couple of them, but I actually thought it would be nice to do a series of 6 or 7 different paintings to just kind of cover that part of the story. And it's fascinated me for a long time, from the time when I first did Cirith Ungol and Samwise sort of looking lost as Frodo's disappeared at that point. So there's more to do there, definitely.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I love those scenes where we get kind of a really narrow focus on the hobbits, especially like the Chapter 3's company is one of my favorite.
There you go, yeah. And that's, part of it where the Hobbit, the flavor of the Hobbit is still in there. And if we know anything about the history of the Lord of the Rings itself, it was originally being composed as a sequel to The Hobbit, and it had a very different tone to it until he realized, of course, he had a much, much bigger story here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
And I love your idea of a series in Mordor. I think that could be really fascinating.
I used to think about portfolios, sort of ideas like that, just like a series of 6 or 7 or 8, paintings and sketches and other things, supplementing them. We'll see, maybe one day, publications of some sort. I am working on an art book, by the way, though. That's been a long-standing problem to many requests over the years, and no real interest from the publishers who just don't think of it as a particularly successful type of book.
Well, they're wrong.
I know. So with a colleague, I'm going to see if we can change that, and we'll come up with the book that we want to have published, and then we'll see if we can, how much of that survives the discussions when we do finally get a publisher interested. And my editor at HarperCollins has expressed mild interest, but I don't want you to quote me on that. But we'll see if there's a little bit of a door slightly ajar there, possibly. But if they have said in the past, they're just, they don't think it would make any money. I'd like to send them all the requests, which probably number in the hundreds and hundreds for an art book, and see if that makes a difference.
Well, it does seem like, at least from the little that I'm able to observe where I am in the Tolkien community, that there has been more willingness to publish an art book recently. I've seen more art books recently than I think I've seen, in a couple decades before. So I think I find that to be very exciting, personally, because I like seeing everyone's different interpretations of the work.
Yeah, right. I don't know why they don't bring out, they had Tolkien's World and Realms of Tolkien. Those are collections of art, some familiar names and some unfamiliar names in there. And, there's no reason why they couldn't do that again. And I assume those were successful. But anyway, I don't know.
So thinking back about the time that you've been engaged with Tolkien's work since the 60s and 70s, do you feel like your approach to working with Tolkien has changed over time? Yeah, I think it has. It would be kind of odd probably if they hadn't evolved somewhat since I've been doing it, I guess, about 50 years. Hard to imagine that, but I'm surprised. This thing has definitely turned out to have legs. And so now I would more trust my own instincts in terms of putting forward what I want to do, and that Durin's Crown mirror scene might be a good example of that, where I just take matters into my own hands and interpret a little more freely rather than literally. And with Tolkien, you can't really literally interpret anyway. A lot of times it's ambiguous descriptions where things are left out that you think, well, if I had him here to ask him questions, I would, be able to sort out what he really meant by, say, Balrog's wings or not, and that kind of idea. But this part of the whole project is just, making your best guess. And I've always said that as long as, fans of my art are happy with what I do, and they're not somehow saying, what happened? Why did you change to what you used to do? Then they're coming along with me where I go, and no one seems to be having any problems. And the recent awards have been a great kind of, confirmation of that. And I don't seem to be running out of ideas. I mean, it's odd that way. I see the Silmarillion as potentially endless, even though I'm glad to see other people going in and doing fairly high-end work as well. And I'd like to think that I may have inspired or opened the door to that to some extent. Yeah, I do love the way that kind of what you were saying earlier, the way that you kind of dip into a work and find a way to elevate it to kind of that professional level like you were talking about earlier, instead of, not all, but a good portion of the earlier art on Tolkien's work was kind of cartoonish or kind of basic pencil sketch stuff and things like that. And I do feel like you are one of the key artists to kind of elevate the artistic landscape. And, it's nothing against those earlier artists like, the Brothers Hildebrand.
Oh, no.
That's an amazing style, and I love that style.
Yeah, like that style has been there, consistent output over decades, and they know what they're doing. It's carefully planned and meticulous. It's just if you're a real fanatic for Tolkien, you're going to see a few misinterpretations and things. But other than that, the exuberance was wonderful, and that definitely I reacted to. It's like, well, you're very colorful scenes, and some of them are very, very good. So it's just like, okay, these are, it's like you hear good music, it makes you want to do good music yourself, and it's the same with art. It sort of catches, and that's all good.
Mm-hmm. And so, do you ever look at the, for lack of a better term, kind of Tolkien art scene and think about different movements within the scene? Like, we started in one place and then I'm part of a second or third wave or something like that, and now we're in a different wave. Is there any kind of structure that you find when you look at Tolkien art?
Yeah, but although I can't say I make much of an effort to do that as a specific objective, but I do see that lately there are trends, and one of them is that Ancalagon has become this gigantic, oversized dragon, and that hangs on one little description Tolkien gave where he is said to have fallen and broken the mountain. There's lots of ways that could be interpreted without it having to mean that this dragon is, like, I don't know, massive, huge, just like indescribably giant compared to all the other dragons in the War of Wrath. And one asks questions like, how did it get out of Zangband then, if it was so big? Or did it sort of grow after it got out the door? Because it certainly couldn't fit through. It's just like these sort of logical conundrums. Anyway, that's just me. And apparently Ungoliant is receiving the same treatment. She's now a massive, gigantic, sky-high spider with this tiny little Morgoth trying to somehow contend with it. But there are also a lot of beautifully rich illustration work being done, new interpretations of some of the classic moments in the books, the Argonath and other kinds of things that we're seeing in the Eagle's Rescue and so on. But I haven't been going to, say, Tolkien Gateway or some of the other places where there are a lot of, like, dozens and dozens of artists and their portfolios on display. But I do get introduced to it here and there. There's a couple of, what do we call them, chat groups. And there's certainly a lot of those now on the internet and social media. And my contacts in there will sometimes, float things by me, say, what do you think of this or that, interpretation of Luthien or some other character. And, and I engage and we get into a good discussion about that at the time. And I will say, I think this is good and maybe that's not so good, and, kind of critique it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just a couple more questions for you. With your own artwork, we just talked about, looking at the kind of art scene. Do you ever look back at one of your old pieces and think, I'd really like to revisit that? And is there one that's kind of asking you to revisit it recently?
Yeah, I think there are some contenders along those lines. With Unfinished Tales, I had a chance to revisit the oath-taking of Kiriel, Errol and Kirion, which I had never felt good about the first time I had it published in, I guess, the 1990s or something. So that was a bother for me, and I was just really, really happy to have another crack at it with more information and more kind of skill and maturity as an artist. Rivendell has come in, as we've talked about, for, let's say, 4 or 5 different versions, and the Fair Valley was definitely an attempt to improve on the first one I'd done, the first larger version of it, detailed landscape, and it was nice to be able to correct the Gondolin thing where it was the wrong season. Minas Tirith, I've done that one maybe 3 or 4 times now, and sometimes large formats. So those have appeared in calendars over the years. And at one time, I followed the description Tolkien gives, where the outer wall, the lowest level of Minas Tirith, is black basalt or something, a little bit like Orthanc. So he plays with black and white color schemes and kind of ideas. Interestingly, at times, it's not necessarily that white is always the good and that black is always the bad sort of thing. He mixes it up, and it's kind of the colors of the stone in the citadel of Gondolin. I liked how Jackson kind of went black and white in the sort of motifs, and that I've kind of followed suit with where I do my own versions of those things too. And Argonath, I'd say another one. I managed to do that 3 or 4 times just because I'm struggling with the scale. Just how big would these things likely have been? And again, it's like I don't want it to be so huge that it's just like ridiculous. And I'll tell you something. I objected to some of the descriptions in George R. R. Martin's castles and landscapes and places when I was dealing with him, and that is because the ice wall, like 700 feet tall. It's just like, no, this is just really, really difficult to get your head around, and it will look weird if you do it. And there were times when he and I would talk about, the artwork that I was being commissioned to do, and I would, allude to, well, have you read the Game of Thrones or the other books for that series?
I'm familiar, but I haven't read them, no.
Okay. One of the castles is called Dragonstone. And when he was describing it, he said the actual castle is in the shape of dragons. There are all these different kind of towers, but they're all sort of dragon-shaped. So I did my best to do that without it looking like Disney. But I did warn him. I said, this is the kind of thing that could easily look really silly, unfortunately. So it's one thing to describe a thing. It's another thing to sometimes see it visually. So, that's part of my job is to kind of work those things out and decide if it's manageable or I'm just going to have to change something or whatever. But that again, that comes into Tolkien as well, where it's you see something where the author suggests something and you realize, no, that's not going to work visually. And if he was aware of that problem, it's one thing to describe, it's another thing to turn it into the visual realm, and I think we would probably have some interesting conversations. But I love the fact that it's up to the artist, it's up to the interpreter, and if you have you can make the case that, this is why I made this alteration, this is why I didn't follow the letter of the author. And he, of course, would probably agree if it was an open discussion. You just have to kind of assume that. Nobody's complaining so far, anyway.
Well, that's always nice.
Yes.
So, I think we can probably all assume what your answer to the next question would be, but let's ask it to see if it leads anywhere interesting. So, do you ever find that you recommend Tolkien's work to someone who's unfamiliar with it, and why do you typically recommend it, or why do you sometimes perhaps not recommend it?
Right. That's funny because I don't know if I recommended it to anyone that I can recall recently, but if it comes up, and it would usually be, I suppose, a young person or someone that I maybe just think hasn't got enough magic or kind of enchantment in their life. I don't know. And you sense that they're the kind of person who just for some reason hasn't given it a chance. And a lot of people do have those opinions that you either love it or hate it. And if you have counted it and you didn't read it, you probably won't bother later either, unless, you had the films and a huge uptick in sales of the books from that. So that was a good exercise in terms of encouraging readership. But let's see. I don't know. I would recommend it because I thought it's something that is so life-changing and so kind of centering and so, incredibly beautiful. I just thought it works on so many levels, and I would just say, it is a life-changing book. Be careful what you open it when you open the book up, open that door and walk out the door. The road goes ever on and all that sort of idea. But I'm a bit of an ambassador, definitely, if I have a chance. I won't shut up, I'm sure.
Well, the last question I have for you is, are you working on anything right now that our listeners could purchase, support, get involved with? Do you have anything for our listeners?
Yeah, at this point in time, I am actually just in between commissions although I am in discussion with some possibilities, but I'm not supposed to talk about that, so I won't. But I have recently finished a lovely commission, which I'm waiting for this gentleman to pick up the original. It was sent over to England, and he's from Croatia. He doesn't want the import duties. I won't, make a long story short here, but when he has it in his possession, I will post the thing on Facebook, the image. And it's a really gorgeous piece. It's Turin and Gwindor at the Pool of Ivrin, at the point when Turin is, of course, consumed by grief from having accidentally killed Beleg. And Gwindor has held the black sword for him throughout the next, phase of the journey until they arrive at the pool. And the pool is a healing, beautiful spot. And it captured my imagination to think, okay, here's where I get to have a nice, dark, northern scene, Scandinavian kind of landscape ideas. And with this beautiful pool, which is blessed by the waters of Almo, by Almo's, and is healing. And we have the waterfall, and figuring out where this waterfall is getting its water from is one of the other conundrums there, because it is a spring-fed pool, supposedly. So there's a couple of ambiguities in the description, but we worked our way through that, and what we have now is a scene where you have, we captured the water, the purity of the water, the crystalline, as it's described, the falls as well, just looking very pure and beautiful and blessed. And then behind that, brooding mountains of dark pines and the odd patch of light coming through with a dark overcast as well. And the idea was that you had the brooding background of Turin's whole kind of life direction, his curse, as it were. But this moment of I guess, blessing, where he's in a place which is sanctified amidst all that. And I thought it was a really, really great juxtaposition of light and dark. So that's what I can share as far as upcoming, and when I do share that one soon. Other than that, we're sort of in the midst of changes and turning to some sketches for possible new things, but I'll have to leave it at that.
I do also want to make sure that our listeners are aware of the illustrated Silmarillion and the illustrated Unfinished Tales that were released over the past couple of years that you were a part of. We mentioned those a couple times throughout the interview, but just to make sure that they know that those are available now. So I want to take this last minute to just tell you thank you so much for joining me for this interview. It has been wonderful to have the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you very much, Luke, and it's been a great pleasure to be here as well and to share with you. Thanks so much for the invitation.
We are so thankful that we have such gracious scholars and fans who want to share their Tolkien experience with us and with you.
We really enjoy making these podcasts, and the fun doesn't stop here.
That's right, it continues on social media. You can find us on Facebook as Tolkien Experience and Twitter as @TolkienEXP. Don't forget to like, follow, share and comment, because we love interacting with you just as much as we enjoy talking to our guests.
For even more content and to join our fellowship of supporters, check out our Patreon by going to patreon.com/Tolkien Experience. Finally, you can also follow our personal Twitter accounts. I'm @Luke B. Shelton.
I'm @SR Westvic.
And I'm @Aaron L. Palmadill. If you have questions or comments, you can send them to us by email at tolkienexperience@gmail.com.
If you want to know more about this week's guest, we provide show notes at tolkienexperience.com. You can find the podcast on all major podcast services, including Apple, Stitcher, and YouTube. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast wherever you listen to it.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, and we truly hope that, in a way, it contributes to your own Tolkien experience.